Lovely, beautiful Karina had once sat on her father's knee on a cold autumn day, weeping at the frozen body of an elderly dog. She had been so very young that in later years she would attribute the memory to some dark dream. It was the year that her mother had died, and she had been only 4. As an adult, she would ask if it were possible to remember events from that far in the past, and she was told it was unusual, but entirely possible. The dog's name had been Roderick. He was a small Scottish terrier that had been her constant playmate for as long as she could remember. Her father had found him wandering the streets, knocking over garbage cans, and brought him home as a gift. It had always been an enigma to Karina when she had heard all the horrible stories about her father. All that she remembered was an older, handsome man who had read her stories and brought her gifts at least once a week. She had loved him, and she had always felt that he had loved her. Her mother had left early that day to run errands in the city. She, with her baby brother, had been left with their father. To her, he never even seemed the least bit foreboding or deceitful. He gave her cookies when she asked, and would make her laugh with funny faces and jokes. He would often speak in German, and had taught her how to introduce herself politely by saying, "Hallo, mein Name is Karina, und ich freue mich, Sie kennen zu lernen." Hello, my name is Karina, and I am pleased to meet you. That morning, he had awakened her, and she had watched as he changed her brother's diaper. She had found this very funny, and had been giggling as the baby laughed and peed. "What do you find so amusing, mein Tochter?" he had said as he wiped his hands in cloth. "Daddies don't change diapers," she had said with her hand over her mouth to stifle her giggles. "Oh, don't they?" he had chuckled. "Well, someone needs to tell your mutter that." She loved the way he said always "mother" in German. She had asked him if she could go outside to play, and he had agreed as long as she wore her cap and scarf. He told her she had to stay in the backyard, where he could see her from the kitchen window while he worked at the dining table. The apartment was small, and the backyard fenced in. She had just walked out to dance in the autumn leaves when she spotted Roderick lying still by the fence. The old dog had been very ill, and it seemed that he had simply lain down as if to rest, and then passed on quietly. She had been devastated, and ran back into the house in tears. Her father had walked across the yard and brought the pitiful little body of her friend inside and laid him on a towel on the floor in the kitchen. He had lifted her into his arms and dabbed the tears from her cheek with a handkerchief from his pocket. "Do not be so sad," he had said calmly. "He was very old, even when I found him. But Papa..." I didn't even get to say goodbye. She had buried her face in his chest, crying, and he had held her close until she heard him sigh. "Can you keep a secret?" he had said, lifting her chin with his hand. "I guess so, as long as it's not bad," she had sniffled. "If I let you say goodbye, will you never tell a soul, not even your mutter?" "But how could you do that?" "Do you promise not to tell?" "I promise." She watched as her father leaned forward and extended his hand over Roderick and began whispering a strange language she had never heard. To her amazement, she saw the little body begin to shake and tremble, and a moment later, the little dog arose stiffly from the floor and looked around the room wearily. "Say goodbye now, He doesn't have very long. She stared at the dog in awe, and then climbing down from her father's lap, patted the terrier's cold, matted fur. Goodbye, Roderick. You were a very good dog, and I will miss you. She kissed him on his head, and she saw her father's hand move slightly. She felt Roderick's cold tongue on her cheek before he lay back down. She looked up at her father as he smiled warmly and gently patted her shoulder. He scooped Roderick up in the towel and took him into the shed to leave him there until he could be buried. When he walked back into the kitchen, he knelt down and said, "Remember your promise." And she always had. It would be one of two promises which he would ask of her. The second came on the day when he had left after a horrible fight with her mother. She had watched him as he was gathering things into a suitcase, and then going to a safe he kept beside his wardrobe. He had turned the dial carefully before opening the door. He withdrew 2 small metal containers the size of cigar boxes, which had little locks on the front of each. He had placed one of the boxes into his suitcase, and taking the other, he had sat down on the side of the bed and called her over quietly. Putting his arm around her shoulder, he had presented her with the container. "I want you to take this, Karina," he whispered. "This is a very special gift from me to you. Now, you must keep this very secret. Your mother is very mad at me, and if she knew you had it, she might try to take it away from you." "But what is it? Why is Mama so sad?" she had whimpered. "Do not ask any questions. This is very important. You must hide this box and keep it always. Someday you will be able to open it, but not for a very long time. Now do you promise to do as I ask?" She nodded that she would. She had taken the box to her room and placed it in the bottom of her hope chest and covered it in a blanket, which had once been on her crib. By the time she had emerged from her room, her father had already gone. She would not see him again until the day that he dropped her and her little brother Eric off at her aunt's. As he had led her to the door of the little farmhouse, he had stopped at the step and stooped down so that his eyes met hers. "Do you remember what I told you about the gift I gave you?" "Yes, Papa," she had answered through her tears. "Remember to always keep it and to never tell anyone." She said that she would, and she always did. No one ever really told her what had happened to her mother. But over the months following her death, she had collected a vague idea through bits of conversations she had overheard from her aunt. At that time, she had known only that her mother had been very sad and taken too many pills. No one would ever explain why her father had left and never came back. However, she had always told herself that her father had loved her, and she had kept this as an unshakable truth. Fate had blessed her with a powerful gift of denial, and she had taken all the sadness and feelings of loss and betrayal and locked them away as if in a small metal box. Karina would over the next few years find that people were drawn to her looks and disposition like moths to a soft, warm flame. She came to thrive on this admiration, and in time would grow to need it as much as food to eat and air to breathe. When she was a teenager, she had starred in a school play, which had been seen by a man who worked for a clothing catalog. Afterwards, he had approached her and given her a number to call if she felt she might like to make some money modeling clothes for the company. At first, she had laughed at the offer, but when her aunt had seen the name given by the phone number, she had become ecstatic. "Do you know who this is, Karina?" she had said, bubbling with excitement. "They sell clothing all over Europe. You have to call him." Karina had said that she would, and then the next day had made an appointment for an interview in Manchester. This would be the beginning of a modeling career that would last 2 decades and take her all over the world. Karina had in time become fascinated with her own image. She looked at the airbrushed, flawless version of herself, which was plastered on billboards and on magazine covers with a sense of awe and horror. There were mornings when she would drag herself out of bed after a night of drinking and cocaine to stand naked in front of her bedroom mirror. She would stare at the thin, sick-looking woman before her with dark circles under her brown eyes and see the uncanny resemblance to her mother. She had not known the woman for long, but what she did know was that the late Petra Strauss would be disgusted with what her daughter had become. Petra had devoted entire entries in her now published journals to her distaste for society's objectification of women and their bodies. What would she have thought had she known that her own daughter would become a vacuous image of sexual idolatry? Karina would smile bitterly as she thought, maybe you should have stuck around to stop it, then, Mother. Karina had come to resent her mother, despite her aunt's long-running attempt to convince her that Petra had been driven to the brink of madness by her father's philandering and perversity. Karina had never truly accepted that distorted image of her father. Her father had loved her, and she believed that. He had never beaten her mother. He had never yelled cruel things at her. Not like the men that Karina had married. Karina had never sat down and put her thoughts and feelings together into any formal analysis of what she thought or believed. That was not Karina's way. Karina just felt things and acted on those feelings. If Karina thought that she was gaining too much weight, then she would stop eating. If Karina felt depressed, then she would snort a line of coke. If Karina liked having sex with a man, then she would marry him. And when she grew tired of being hit and degraded, then she would divorce him. She had lived in this manner for many years, but eventually she had begun aging. And even though she felt that she did not like it, she could not stop it. Her breasts had begun to sag and the lines on her face had deepened. And no matter how much she felt that it was wrong or unfair, after all the years she had spent being worshipped, it had finally occurred to her that being beautiful was what had truly been important to her. The woman who she had seen in all those pictures had been the real her, and the sad, selfish creature who she saw in the mirror was only that woman's shadow. Now, after the admirers were gone, and no one called her to advertise their new clothing line, the shadow was all that was left. The thought had occurred to her that it would probably have been better if she had just died before the shadow had taken over. There was a time when she would have pushed to the edge of that impulse. She had seen the fall of her career on the horizon, and she had begun an unrelenting daily regimen of self-destruction. She had married a rich psychopath who at times had seemed more than capable of killing her, either through bizarre violence or enabling her excesses. But at the last moment, she had faltered. There had been a strange and secret longing within her that maybe, just maybe, there might be something else waiting beyond the bloodshot, lifeless eyes of the wraith in the mirror. Maybe, unconsciously, she had just wanted to know what was in the little metal box. So she had pulled herself together and checked into rehab. While there, she had filed for divorce from the psychopath and picked up a camera. This instrument, which had played such a huge part in the creation of the lie that she had become. They had all expected her to begin photographing models and rejoin the industry, but instead she had disappeared and taken pictures of the world she had ignored for so long. She had discovered that the camera could do more than just create deception. It could capture moments out of time and reveal truth when nothing else could. She had taken pictures of sunsets and children, of cities and countrysides, of the homeless and the haunted. She had disregarded what she saw in the mirror, and instead became one herself. And in the course of reflecting the world, she had found that she was still a part of it. It had taken a lifetime, but Karina had finally stopped seeing herself through the eyes of others. Finally, she had acquired a vision of her own and had begun to perceive the true beauty and horror that was around her. Inside, the phone had ringed, but she had been too tired and relaxed to answer. She had listened from outside as her own answering machine recorded her aunt's voice as she informed Karina that her father had died. She offered no details, but Karina had known that he had been missing for weeks. She had sat in the cold autumn night watching the low wavering flames in the fire pit. She huddled even further into the blanket wrapped around her shoulders and felt very alone beneath the vast starlit sky. Inside, she had stared at the bookshelf on her bedroom wall before carefully sliding a copy of her mother's last published volume of collected poetry from between Paradise Lost and a collection of stories by H.P. Lovecraft. She had bought the book many years previous, but had never had the courage to read it. She had laid down in her bed and stared for a long time at the picture on the back. There were so few pictures of her mother, and always they used the same black and white photograph. Petra, seated in a study, clothed in a warm sweater, staring mystically from a desk beside a typewriter. The woman, in her vague recollections, was no mystic. She had been an over-emotional wreck prone to frequent outbursts of dramatic frenzy coupled with prolonged periods of brooding, pensive silence. However, as she opened the cover and began to read, she realized that perhaps she had been wrong. Karina had lived on the surface of a great ocean. She had stared down at the deep blue below and saw nothing but her own reflection. In the past few years, she had begun to dip her face into the water and peer below. As she read further and further into the book, she realized that sometime long ago, her mother had plunged deep into the depths, and there had been lost. The poems were dark and frightening. Seeing the world through Petra's intense, disturbing perceptions was nightmarish and beautiful. Her mother had lived in fear and awe of life's all-consuming horrors and divinity. And if Karina had ever wondered why her mother had ended her own life, it was stamped on every page of the book held in her trembling hands. Here was a documentation of a person's profound alienation from the ongoing blindness of the people that surrounded her. Here was a person who had longed to find at least one other who could share in her vision, and when she thought she had, she was betrayed. Yet in those pages was reflected a blindness of Petra's own, an inability to focus and appreciate the simple beauty of daily existence, and an arrogant defiance of her own kinship to the lives of her fellow human beings. She had placed herself above and below, while never settling on the firm ground which lay between heaven and hell. Karina had read far into the night, and as she finally closed the book and laid it aside, she felt that she had just bore witness to a chronicle of illness. This was a recorded journal detailing a soul's torment and sickness as it deteriorated into blackness. She fell asleep and dreamed of the box. She slept through most of the following day until she was awakened by the sound of her doorbell being rang 3 times. She had risen from her bed and, pulling on a robe, walked through the living room to the front door. When she opened it, there was no one outside, but there, laying on the step, was a small delivery box. She picked it up and found it to be light enough to be empty. Inside, she made herself coffee and sat on the kitchen table as she cut the sealing tape with a steak knife and carefully opened her package. The inside was stuffed with old newspaper, but as she dug into the center, she found a small ball of bubble wrap held by a rubber band. Removing the band, she unrolled the paper and beheld a small brass key. Holding the tiny object in her hand, she knew there could be no other lock to which it could belong than to the gift given to her so long ago. Karina crept into her bedroom and opened the closet as she gazed down at the hope chest, which had been the one item she had retained from her distant childhood. She opened it reverently and studied the top layer of photo albums and framed pictures of various grandparents and family. She placed these to the side as she moved through the collections of letters and postcards, along with a jewelry box and a folder of savings bonds. There at the bottom was the little quilt made by her grandmother for her crib, and beneath that, the small metal box. She took it in her hands for the first time since she was 4. It had remained a buried and secret reminder of the most painful days of her early life. Then the box had seemed large and heavy, but now she was surprised by its lightness and small size. She took it to the bed, where she sat down and placed it on her lap as she removed the key from her robe pocket. Her hands were shaking and sweaty as she placed the key into the lock. It slipped in easily, forcing the growing feelings of sorrow and the welling torrents of vicious memory into a dark pit within her chest. She turned it and opened the lid. The inside was lined with dark velvet, and lying in the soft center was coiled a silver chained necklace. She lifted the chain and held it in the air as she studied the small piece of rose quartz, which hung suspended at the end. There it was, her father's last gift. A mere bauble. This one single mystery which had plagued her throughout all these long years had been a simple, cheap amulet, probably bought during one of his trips across Europe. She laughed bitterly as the stone swung from side to side. What did she expect? A letter of apology, an explanation of why her childhood had been destroyed. She dropped the trinket back into the box and closed the lid before laying it on the bedside table. She took her memories and placed them back into the hope chest, feeling like a sad and pathetic fool. The last dream of her childhood had finally been put to rest. Diedrich had 2 hours until his flight left for Charleston, West Virginia. After a few phone calls, he had located Karina Drescher and now was preparing to go meet her. He had originally viewed his sojourn to find Petra's children as some strange psychological intervention in which he would be attempting to see if he could reconcile the two siblings with their pasts. Now, however, after his experience in Manchester, he had become acutely aware that this favor was of a much more grave and serious nature. With all that had happened and the closing of the case in Berlin, he had been granted a month's leave of absence. Having never taken an official vacation during all his years as a policeman, it had been a small thing for him to receive permission. He had in his hand a small piece of paper on which Peter White had scribbled the name and address of a woman living in London who had been known to have discreetly helped police on a number of occasions by using her peculiar abilities. "If anyone I've ever met is actually a psychic, then it is her," Peter had said as he pulled the card from the index roll on his desk. Diedrich didn't know exactly what he was looking for. If anything, he desperately wanted advice. After everything he had witnessed, he had come to the conclusion that there had to be others like him, and someone amongst them must have more information on the nature of these gifts. This woman, Rochelle Weston, worked as a professional astrologer and psychic in the greater London area. As Diedrich approached the rented office space several blocks from the square, he was reminded of his grandfather, who had ran a very similar business in Germany before the war. Was it possible that there had been a hidden truth lying in wait for him all these years? He had made an appointment that morning to see Miss Weston, but as time for his departure to America drew near, he felt hesitation and doubt. What if this woman was a charlatan? Peter had said that she had found murder victims and located lost children, but what if these had just been coincidences, flukes, or plain common luck? Still feeling more desperate than cynical, he opened the door and walked into the office. As she entered, a bell rang over the door, and he glanced at a table set by the far wall, but no one was present to greet him. He stood warily for a moment as he crumpled the paper into his pocket and waited. A moment passed before a young girl with strawberry red hair and a profusion of freckles walked from a room in the back holding a stack of folders in her hands. "Are you the 1230? The girl asked as she noisily chewed at her gum. "I believe so," he answered awkwardly. "Mum, your 1230's here," she shrieked before dropping the stack on the table and turning to Diedrich said, "She's still finishing lunch. She'll be a minute. Take a seat, mister." She then stumped off down back into the room from where she had come. Diedrich did as he was instructed and sat impatiently drumming his fingers on the table until a short, heavy woman with a mass of curly red hair like the adolescent's walked into the room, wiping her hands on a napkin. "Mr. Abendroth," she questioned as she eyed him strangely with sparkling hazel eyes. Yes, that is correct," he answered, trying to sound courteous despite his irritation. "You related to old Gerhold Abendroth," she said as she eased down into the chair across from him. Diedrich's eyes widened with surprise. "Yes, he was my grandfather." "You look just like him." "Do you have his pipe?" She stared at her with confusion. "I can smell pipe tobacco all over you. Every picture I ever saw of him, he had this wicked dragon pipe. I'd love to see it if you got it." Still shaken by her instant recognition, Diedrich removed the pipe from his coat and held it gingerly for her to inspect. "That's it! Bloody hell, you're the spitting image of him. He was a touch, no. But not you. You've got something else going on, don't you?" Diedrich was stunned. He had not been in any way prepared to leap into a conversation like the one he was already having. "Honestly, Frau Weston, I don't know." "Oh, I get it. You just woke up then, haven't you? You've got it strong, though. It's all over you like the smell of that pipe. Why'd it take so long? You a drinker, or was it needles? Hard drugs are the worst. They'll keep you down for your whole life." I just recently stopped drinking," he answered shamefaced. "Oh, you probably don't know shit then. Your grandfather got whacked by the Nazis before he could tell you anything too, I bet." "Yes, you are correct." "Well, let's talk then. You can smoke if you want. It smells like you got some of that good Borkum Riff cherry." Diedrich did not need to be told twice. He removed the tobacco from his coat and began packing the deep bowl of the pipe as the woman stared at him intently. "You made a bit of a mess in Berlin, didn't you?" she said conversationally as he withdrew his matches. "Yes, it was a very strange case," he mumbled as he struck a match and began puffing clouds of sweet smoke. "It's all over the telly about Inspector White. He's a damn fine cop. He is at that. I am very grateful that he was unharmed. You know, there was a conjunction of Pluto and Saturn over Brookwood that day." Does that mean something?" he said, trying not to sound patronizing. "Pluto is the planet of death and rebirth, and Saturn rules over karma and destiny. If you believe in that sort of thing, that is." "Do you believe, Mr. Abendroth?" Diedrich looked at her with the utmost sincerity as he leaned over the table, wisps of smoke drifting from the dragon's head. "I have experienced things in the past month which made me doubt my very sanity, Frau Weston. If you know anything which may clarify this madness for me, you will find me very receptive. Good! I didn't want to have to waste my time trying to convince you I'm not full of shit. Now first tell me how long that ghost been following you around. Dietrich felt as if he had been kicked in the groin by a draft horse. Is she here? He asked with a sudden longing as he glanced around the room. Oh yes, she's in quite a state. Now, you've already answered my second question, which was, can you see spirits? Dietrich's expression became distressed as he ran his hand through his black-white streaked hair. That is one of my questions. You see, I was in a very close contact with this spirit for a time, and now she seems to be blocked from me. Rochelle smiled, revealing uneven but pearly white teeth beneath her rose-colored lipstick. Now we're getting down to it. You're not a medium, but for a time, you saw her as if she was almost living, I'll wager. You would win that bet. Now, what I'm going to explain is going to be a bit hard for you to swallow. But the reason she became so vivid to you was because of the presence of a powerful entity. Dietrich suddenly felt very cold. What kind of entity? He asked as he began to inadvertently recall the night at the hotel. I've been aware of the presence of something very dark and twisted nearby over the past few months. Now I'm just going to take a stab in the dark here, Mr. Eppendorf, and suggest that all this is related to the Dreschers. Dietrich nodded slowly at the sharp intellect which cut through him from Rochelle's eyes. That's what I thought. Old man Drescher turns up dead in Berlin. Then his son dies a few days later. That's Petra Strauss standing behind you, isn't it? Dietrich nodded again as Rochelle's look grew even more intense. Did you have something to do with Eric Drescher's death? I was there at the hotel that night, he answered, his voice nervous and low. And no one saw you. I was seen, but I managed to somehow hide myself afterwards. You mean you hid yourself from their minds? Rochelle's eyes were wide with disbelief. It appears to be one of my gifts, you might say. Holy Mother of Jesus, she said, making the sign of divinity across her ample chest. I've never met one like you. Can you read minds? No, but I can make suggestions to others that are almost commands. It seems to operate almost like an involuntary reflex. Oh, my dear man, you've got to get hold on that. You could do some serious damage if you're not careful. The thought has occurred to me already, but I am afraid the how of controlling it eludes me. Why, you control your mind, of course. You've got to practice impulse control. You got to get a grip on your will and your desires. I will take it under consideration. What else can you do? I seem to be able to see events and make connections intuitively. Remote viewing, is that what it's called? Yes. It'd be very handy in your line of work too, I might add. You've probably been doing it on some level since you were a child. Once more, I would have to agree. What happened in the hotel with Eric Drescher? I was hoping you could tell me. First, tell me what you saw. After he had finished, Rochelle stared at him with a shrewd and thoughtful stare. What is your religious affiliation, Mr. Abendroth? Truly none. I was raised Presbyterian. I cannot tell you exactly what the thing was you confronted in the hotel. A few hundred years ago, we might have said it was a demon. Yet somewhere, in some other place, it might have been worshipped as a god. What I can tell you is that in truth, it is energy. You have to remember that at one time, there was only one true religion in the entire world, and that was the worship of spirits. I believe that in those days, there were far fewer people, and they were much more attuned to the secret inner workings of the universe. Back then, I would say that there were many entities, like the one running around wild in the world. Nowadays, we try to categorize them as either good or evil, but these beings do not function by the precepts of our created philosophies. Their needs and goals are seemingly of a very basic and primal nature. In ancient times, men were hunted by many predators, and we labeled them all as evil. Now we look at these animals and we see them as merely trying to feed, reproduce, and survive. The thing to remember about these entities, Mr. Abendroth, is that by their very nature, they alter the laws that we see as the set boundaries of reality. Just like the other forms of energy, each one is different and has a different effect on its environment. But when it comes into contact with a human consciousness, which can harness it, the energy becomes altered. We know of electricity. It is a form of energy that we have witnessed and worshipped since the dawn of time in its natural state. We see what it does. We know its properties and its dangers. However, once we channel it through technology, it can be a very beneficial force, or a very destructive one, he finished. Precisely. And therein lays the key to understanding these things. One culture may worship a spirit as a god of healing, while another may fear it as a lord of deceit. What you have in the end is an energy that is being projected by the humans using it into a shape created by intention. Just as fire keeps you warm or destroy countless lives. I would bet that this thing was at one time somewhat benign until Emmerich Drescher discovered it. However, history tells that once these entities are given a purpose, they seldom revert back into dormancy. But how could he have even found a thing such as you describe? Even as he thought of how insane the conversation was sounding, he could find no more doubt in his mind that everything she was saying was true. They are drawn to psychics, and us to them. We can draw on their energy, and in turn, they can use us to physically affect the world. If you were to study the law concerning these things, then you would find that individual familiar bloodlines can be joined into a certain entity, and the spirit will track the offspring of those bound to it for generations. But if there's something of your story which I feel I must question, and what would that be? You mentioned that before the ghost of Petra Strauss left you to come here to England and save the whites, that she borrowed energy from you. You believe that this is how she was able to physically manipulate objects once in Drescher's hideout. It is merely a theory, but yes, I would say you are quite right, Mr. Abendroth. Certain entities can increase a spirit's ability to manipulate objects, but what you described was of a completely different nature. As far as I am aware, different psychics are possessed of various means of acquiring energy. There are those born to a genetic bond with an entity, those like you who are capable of stealing power from said entities, and then there are those who can acquire energy by drawing it from other psychics. Those of the latter variety tend to be individuals born with a psychological or physical defect which often will leave them with a weakened bond to the earthly realm during their mortal life. These people will more often than not find themselves drawn to those of a strong psychic potential and will, in an almost parasitic sense, feed off of them. You think that Petra may have been one of these individuals? It would make perfect sense. During her lifetime, she was profoundly depressed and self-destructive up until the point when she met Emmerich Drescher, who we know to have been a powerful medium. I think it is possible that unconsciously she was drawing from his reservoir of power in order to further sustain her earthly existence. And now, as a spirit, she is still capable of siphoning power from a host psychic. Frau Weston, you make her sound like a succubus. Dietrich laughed, only to find Rochelle's face serious and stern. Does that strike you as so impossible? History's full of tales of ghosts who return from the dead to feed upon the living. Listening to you, I'm under the impression that you left out a good deal of detail concerning your interactions with Miss Strauss. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I get a definite feeling that your contact with her was one of a strong amorous nature. Dietrich looked down at the table with embarrassment. That's what I thought. She was smiling in a lurid way, which made Dietrich uncomfortable. Don't look so sheepish, Dietrich. Far be it from me to judge you. She was quite an attractive woman. But just let me warn you that such a relationship could be best considered a very high-risk behavior. Just remember that a spirit such as hers is a very unpredictable and unstable thing. Her actions in life were impulsive and often destructive. I fear that she may not have changed all that greatly since dying. I will keep that in mind, but now my time is running short, and I must go. Dietrich stood and extended his hand. I must thank you, Frau Weston. I am truly grateful that you have found someone as knowledgeable as you. Consider me a friend, Dietrich. She took his hand and shook it warmly. You have my number. Call me if you should ever need someone to talk to. There are only a few of us who are awake, and it helps for us to stay in contact. Dietrich nodded and walked to the door. He wished he had more time to learn from Rochelle's experience, but the promise he had made to Petra could not be delayed. He told himself that someday he would return to learn more from the strange woman. Rochelle watched as the tall German left her office with a sense of deep concern. She saw in him a truly well-intentioned soul who had quickly stumbled into a world far beyond his comprehension. She heard footsteps to her side and looked down to see her daughter Matilda standing calmly at her elbow. Did you get those files organized? Rochelle asked as she put her arm around her daughter's shoulder. Yeah. Can I go to Sundays now? Yes, I'll be back by dinner. Matilda began to walk towards the door before she stopped and turned with a quizzical expression. Mom, she said, squinting as if pondering some riddle. He knows that there's a half-crazed ghost woman following him around, right? Yes, dear. car flew down the narrow back street beneath the stale glow of periodic street lamps. The pavement was damp with melted snow as the wheels cut through the murky puddles and flew through the four-way intersections without even the slightest break in speed. Cracks in the car windows spilled out clouds of smoke as it tore through the neighborhoods on a reckless, self-destructive course. The Mustang's engine growled as it ran up a steep hill and leapt, momentarily defying gravity, through the night to crash onto the front suspension and bounce as if swerved dangerously before regaining its momentum. "What a fucking prick!" Marianne shouted as she slammed her hand against the steering wheel. Her eyes were red with weed, tequila, and tears as her foot remained planted against the gas pedal. "How could someone do that?" she shouted, drawing uneasy and nervous stares from her two passengers. "Calm down, Marianne," Janelle says, her hands broke into a clammy sweat around the neck of her Jose Cuervo. "You knew Fox was an asshole when you started dating it." "But she's a high school girl. He left me for some bubble-blowing cheerleader bitch. He's 25 years old, for God's sake." "Yeah, but he's mentally still in diapers," Luann said from the back seat. "But he just moves out and leaves me with the rent. He knows I ain't got no place to go. How can someone be so fucking selfish?" "He's a drug dealer, Marianne," Janelle said as she carefully pulled the seatbelt over her chest and snapped it in place. "They're not exactly known for being the most responsible people in the world. Why ask me to marry him and then run off with some little kid? It makes me absolutely no sense." Marianne was looking at Janelle for an uncomfortably long period of time, during which she did not even glance at the road in front of them. Why don't you just pull over and let me drive?" Janelle's voice was low and steady as she placed her hand on Marianne's shoulder. "I mean, we can just get out of town and talk this out." "You've spent too much time in rehab, Janelle," Marianne sneered as she grabbed the bottle and took a long drink as the car fishtailed onto the blacktop. "You're beginning to sound like a fucking therapist." "Seriously," Luann said, kicking the back of the seat. "If you're planning on killing yourself in a car wreck, you can just let us out." "Fine." Marianne took a deep breath as she glared at Luann in the rearview mirror. She finally eased her foot off of the accelerator and the car slowed as she gripped the steering wheel with both hands. Janelle sighed in relief, and she looked ahead at the curving road as the headlights beamed out into the dense woods, which stood patched with snow around them. "I mean, it's my fucking birthday. I come home and there's a note pinned on the fridge with a stupid frog magnet saying, 'Sorry, babe, it's over.' Men are all assholes," Luann repeated the well-known fact for the 100th time that night. "I told you that dating guys because they have cool tattoos is not a wise way of finding life partners." She lit a cigarette and brushed her shaggy mop of black hair as if it would help calm her. "Maybe I should just date insecure guys who buy me things like you," Marianne said, laughing as the tension finally broke. Luann leaned back in the seat and studied the silver bracelet on her wrist with appraising eyes. "You could, but you'll have to learn to stop putting out for every guitar player to get you high." "Yeah, at least hold out for someone who actually gets paid to play guitar," Janelle added, as she began skipping through the songs on the CD player, passing Fantastic Slide and Whoop, There It Is, until she settled on Loser by Beck. She closed her eyes and began to nod her head along with the drum beat as the familiar slide guitar began playing. "Oh shit, I just realized where we're at," Marianne said, smiling, as she wiped her nose off on the sleeve of her red flannel. "Remember when I first got my driver's license and we used to come out here looking for the Mothman?" It had been a common practice for teenagers growing up in Point Pleasant to go hunting for the legendary cryptid since the early 1970s, and the three girls had been no exception. "Yeah, there we were, all huddled in the TNT bunker with all our flashlights. God, we were dorks." Luann was smiling despite her sarcasm. "You're still a dork. We just didn't want to tell you." Marianne was quickly recovering from her rage and was now lost in recollections of their shared adolescence. "We should have stayed dorks, and then maybe we wouldn't be here getting high in the same car your dad bought you when you were 16. Janelle's unwelcome realism earned her a slap on the back of her purple-black striped head from Luann. "Shut up, Janelle," Luann said, rolling her eyes. "Marianne would be doing fine if she didn't suffer from cock blindness." What the hell is that supposed to mean? Marianne retorted as she once more glanced in the mirror. It means every time a guy whips his dick out, you can't see anything else. You bitch! Marianne said with mock fury as she reached behind the seat to swing at Luann. But she stopped when suddenly they heard a loud, heavy thump on the roof of the car. What was that? Janelle was staring at the ceiling as a muffled scraping sound moved above them. Marianne tapped the brakes as the car slowed, and Janelle turned down the music so they could hear the scuffling taps and scratches overhead. Maybe it's a bird, Janelle offered. Birds usually don't land on the top of moving cars, Marianne replied. Maybe it's the Mothman, Luann laughed as the sound got louder. Not funny, Marianne snapped, just as a single loud crash dented in the roof between her and Janelle. The girls screamed as Marianne slammed on the brakes and the car slid sideways until it had spun completely 360 degrees in the road. They sat unmoving and terrified as the rustling sound stopped, and it seemed as if the weight had been lifted from the cab. They sat listening to the sound of the humming motor and had just allowed themselves a calming breath when suddenly the thing slammed down onto the roof with enough force to cave in the ceiling almost to the tops of their heads. Go, Marianne! Luann screamed as she punched the seat. Marianne needed no further encouragement as her foot stomped down to the floor and the tires spun across the blacktop. For a moment, the car was filled with thumps and scratches as if something were clawing erratically at the top of the car. And then as the Mustang began to take off and build speed, Luann glanced out the back window just in time to see the large, dark wings carry a man-sized shadow off into the night. The three girls had never been so glad to see the lights of Point Pleasant shining ahead of them on the road. They pulled over at the gas station that stood directly across the road from Marianne's older brother Jacko's auto shop. They carefully crawled from the Mustang and stood dumbstruck in the cold morning air, examining the ruin imposed on the car. What the hell could have done that? Janelle said as she took a Virginia Slim from its crushed box and hung it from her lips with shaking fingers before struggling with the lighter before a flame appeared. Let's just go inside and order some breakfast. Think this through, Marianne answered as she rushed on wobbly legs to the door. Inside, they sat in a corner booth and waited until a waitress they knew from high school with tired eyes arrived to take her their order. She said nothing about their ruffled, nerve-racked appearance, but eyed them suspiciously as she wrote on the small notepad in her hand. It was as Jonelle finished placing her order for an extra-large stack of pancakes that Betty Jo, as she was known, caught a glimpse of the Mustang through the window. Her jaw went slack as she gazed down at them. What the hell happened to your car, Marianne? She said, awestruck. Marianne looked up, stammering and panic-stricken. A deer, Luann snapped. Biggest goddamn buck I've ever seen, she said, thumping the table for emphasis. Son of a bitch jumped out of the woods and landed right on top of the car. Janelle and Marianne wordlessly nodded their agreement. Betty Jo looked at their faces and seemed to think better of questioning them further. Shrugging her shoulders, she walked to the kitchen where the three could see her already beginning a chain of gossip that would not end for weeks. A deer, Jacko said, as he pulled a packet of nicotine gum from his pocket and began inserting small squares in his mouth until he gnawed on 3. Biggest goddamn deer I've ever seen, Marianne said, repeating Luann's brilliant lie. She gave Jacko her best little innocent girl look, but his stern hazel eyes pierced through to her soul. It looks like you rolled it, Marianne. He was looking at the rest of the car for telltale signs of dirt and damage, but found none. Then how come it's only dented on the top? She said nervously, gesturing at the cab. Yeah, there's scratches up there too. I guess they could be made by hooves. The point is, sis, this is going to cost a fortune to fix. He removed his hat and scratched his head through a nest of thick brown-gray hair. I'm broke, Jacko. Fucking Fox left me yesterday for some teenager. She kicked a rock angrily as she remembered the humiliation. On your birthday? Jacko shook his head with disgust. I told you he was no good druggie. If you weren't stoned all the time, maybe you would have seen that. Could we skip the lecture this once, Jacko? I need help. Well, I'll do what I can, but it ain't gonna be Cherry. Man, Dad'd roll over in his grave if he saw this shit. Hell, he'd probably disown you if he saw what you were into, Marianne. She stared at him on the verge of tears before he finally relented. Okay, fine, here. He reached into his back pocket and removed his checkbook and pen. He began scribbling and then peeled out the note with little ducks in the corner and handed it to her. She looked at it for a moment with shame before taking it and putting it in her shirt pocket. That's 1 month's rent, Marianne. Consider it your birthday present. You still got a job at the post office, right? She nodded. Good. Don't lose it. He walked off into the shop without another word, and she quietly made her way back to the diner to finish her cold, soggy pancakes. He's gonna fix it, Janelle said as Marianne slumped down into the booth. Yeah, he wasn't overjoyed about it. He'll get over it, Luann said before she drained her orange juice and gazed out the window at the distant sunrise. He shouldn't have to. He's been bailing me out since I was 14. It makes him feel needed, Janelle said as she belched. He's got 4 kids, Janelle. I'm sure he feels needed enough without my help. Marianne began to guiltily fork a layer of flapjacks into her mouth and chew when the door of the gas station opened, and a stranger entered and headed for a table. Janelle nudged Marianne and nodded at the tall man who was seating himself. They listened carefully as he made his order of biscuits and gravy with a thick German accent. He was very handsome, with sharp aquiline features and thick black hair, with a few white streaks which receded slightly at his temples. He wore blue jeans and a black shirt beneath a long overcoat, but he gave the impression of someone who might typically wear a suit and tie. He looks like Dracula, Janelle said with a strangely hungry look, which the other two recognized as lust. I bet he's got some money, too, Luann said as she noticed the expensive boots he wore as he removed a notebook from his briefcase and began writing. You two must be in heat, Marianne sighed. He's old enough to be your dad. He's not that old, Janelle said. I see what you mean about Dracula, Luann said, smiling brightly. He kind of looks like that English actor who was in all those Hammer horror films in the 60s and 70s. Christopher Lee, Janelle whispered excitedly. I wonder if he wants to drink my blood, Luann laughed. It was only then that they noticed that he was staring at them with deep-set, brooding eyes. Excuse me, damn it, I mean ladies. His accent was thick, but he spoke English well with a low baritone voice. All 3 women momentarily felt a shiver pass over them. Yes, Janelle answered enthusiastically. Are you 3 from this town? He was smiling slightly, and they felt immediately as if he were a warm and honest individual despite his vampire-esque appearance. Born and raised, Janelle chirped happily. Oh my God, Marianne thought. We're going to end up as Dracula's 3 concubines. I do not want to disturb you, but I was wondering if you might help me find someone in this area. My name is Dietrich Abendroth, and I am looking for a woman named Karina Drescher. Janelle looked visibly disappointed as she answered. Oh, yeah, she lives just outside of town. She's got a nice place out by the wildlife reserve. You a friend of hers from Europe? He looked down at his notebook for a moment before answering. I was a friend of her mother's. Well, she's easy enough to find. Just follow this road here until you get out past the cemetery, and there's a sign that points down a drive into the woods that says Drescher Photography. It's a nice big ranch-style house. You can't miss it. I thank you. If you don't mind, I would like to pay for your meal in return for kindness. Sure, Marianne burst before smiling with embarrassment. I mean, that would be wonderful. Hey, if you need a place to stay, you could get a room at the Low. I work there at the desk. It's really nice. Janelle was pulling in a strand of purple hair flirtatiously. I will take that under consideration, he answered graciously as Betty Jo brought his plate with a smile shining in her small blue eyes. Will that be all? She said, with a feline purr. He answered that it would be, and that he would be paying for the three's breakfast as well. How nice of you. If you need anything, just let me know. Luann rolled her eyes and made a gesture with her hand and tongue pressed against her cheek, which insinuated a certain carnal activity Betty Jo might be willing to indulge in. Marianne pondered with a certain philosophical wonder how her friends had went from nervously contemplating an attack by an enraged cryptid to flirting with a strange German who looked like he was possibly a Nosferatu.